So I want to take just a couple of minutes, if I can, a few slides to show you, to try to wrap up everything that we've heard today, summarize a lot of what's been talked about. Almost everything I'm going to say to you and almost every slide I'm going to show to you has been said by someone today. So I'm going to try to bring it all together for you. I think, first of all, we all recognize at amfAR that now is the time for the cure. For all of the reasons that you've heard, both in terms of where we are, what the challenges are going forward, what the resource challenges are, the economic environment in which we live, all of that clearly points to the fact that now is the time. But I think it's important to remember some of the other things that were said. 34 million people living with HIV and AIDS today in the world. An astonishing 7,000 people become infected with HIV each and every day. 7,000 people become infected around the world. And incredibly, more than 15 million children have lost one or both of their parents to AIDS. 15 million AIDS orphans around the world. Close to 2 million people die of AIDS-related causes each and every year. So we've got 34 million people living with HIV. More than 70 million people have been infected since the beginning of the epidemic, and more than 2 million people die every single year from AIDS-related causes. And this has been said throughout the day, but to put it into perspective, for every person that goes on treatment, somewhere between 2 and 3 more people become infected with HIV. There are more than 6 million people around the globe today receiving treatment. There are literally billions and billions of dollars being spent to scale up our treatment efforts. And yet for each person that gets put on treatment, 3 more people, 2 to 3 more people become infected with HIV. I think ultimately what this tells us, and it's been said and said again today, we cannot treat our way out of the epidemic. We cannot achieve the ends that we're looking for solely by putting more and more people on treatment. That's not going to get us where we need to go. Despite the reductions in cost of treatment, it remains, in many parts of the world, prohibitively expensive, and that's what Mark was talking about. Remember, with 34 million people infected with HIV and somewhere around 6 million people receiving treatment, we still have a long way to go just to provide treatment to the people who need it. And the cost, even with those reductions, is simply exorbitant. And the long-term side effects of treatment, I think, still remain, in some cases, unknown. We know many of the drugs are intolerable on certain levels, but even with the great strides that have been made on treatment, there are still intolerable side effects. And long-term side effects are something that's not been well defined. So what does it mean? It means there's 2 ways out of this epidemic, really, in the long term. We need a vaccine, and we need a cure. And what you've heard, I think, throughout the day today is that amfAR's obviously committed to and investing in a cure. When we look at vaccine research, according to the AIDS Policy Project, a group down in Philadelphia, in 2010, vaccine research received $859 million, almost $1 billion in funding for vaccine research, which is terrific, which is extraordinary, and it is terrific. But according to that same report, only 3% of our AIDS research our government's AIDS research budget in 2009 was focused on cure research. Only 3%. Since 2002, amfAR has been allocating 40% of its research grants budget to cure-focused research. And in fact, in the last 3 years, we've allocated nearly 70% of all of our research grants to cure-focused research. And we're doing this not because we think it's a pipe dream, not because we think it's something off in the future down the road, but because we think it's something that can be done, and it's something that we think we can do in our lifetime. And we're going to need a roadmap to getting there. And we have a vision for doing that. First of all, and this has been said, I think, throughout the day in a number of different ways, we've got to bring people together to do this. We've got to get researchers working across different disciplines. Dr. Markowitz, my friend up here, was talking exactly about this just a few minutes ago. Because the reality is, a lot of research happens in a laboratory, at a research institution, at a university somewhere, with a grant that a scientist has received, probably from the NIH, maybe from amfAR. But ultimately, the kind of collaboration and the kind of creative ideas that are going to be necessary aren't going to happen by a single scientist working in a lab. They're going to happen when we get bright people together in a room and we get them thinking about collective ideas. And in fact, at amfAR, we created an initiative specifically to look at that and to try to achieve that, and it's called ARCH. It's the amfAR Research Consortium for HIV Eradication. You heard about the Marty Delaney program at the NIH, and it's a very similar type of approach in that we're getting scientists together, we're sort of putting them in a room, and we're saying the only way you get our money is if you agree to play together. So come up with ideas that cut across disciplines, that bring different specialties together and bring us those ideas. Those are the ones we're interested in funding. And in fact, we've already funded a number of pretty extraordinary ideas right out of the gate. We had a scientist from San Francisco who happens by coincidence to be Tim Brown's doctor, and a scientist at Johns Hopkins, a man named Bob Silicano, whose name has been on a few slides today, who got together and had this idea about a drug that Dr. Silicano had and a patient population that Dr. Deeks had, and how could they get a research study going. They actually wrote a research protocol in under 2 weeks. And we were able to fund that study in under 3 months. And they had their first patients enrolled in under 4 months. So an extraordinary amount achieved in a very short time by putting bright people together and saying, let's work together. We also know that we need the NIH, we need government involved, and we need people like Daria Hazuda. We need industry involved. Nobody's going to do this by themselves, right? We're going to have all of the players engaged in a way that's going to get us to where we want to be. We've also got to fund every good idea. We can't afford not to. At amfAR, we issue what we call requests for proposals. We put an idea out into the field and we say to scientists, bring us your best ideas. Tell us what you have. And typically, when we issue one of these, we'll get about 100 letters of intent, maybe 125, maybe 90, but somewhere around there we typically get 100. And out of that 100 letters of intent, we will invite around 40 to give us full applications, meaning to go through the process of really fleshing out their research idea and give us those 40 applications. From those 40 applications, our independent scientific advisory committee, which will review all of them, will tell us that somewhere between 15 and 20 of those rank the highest. They rank the highest in terms of funding. And out of that 15 to 20 applications that arrive, we will be able to fund about 8 of them. That means 50% or less of all of the fundable ideas will be funded by us. That means half, at least, of all good ideas in that round will go unfunded. That's a resource challenge. Half of all good ideas go unfunded. And frankly, we just can't afford to leave good ideas on the shelf. If we're going to get to where we want to be, and we're going to get there in the time that we want to get there, we've got to fund every good idea. Finally, we can't do it alone. It's not just amfAR, it's not just the NIH, it's not just industry. We've got to do it together. We can continue to play a leadership role. We can continue to try and lead this effort to catalyze the new ideas that Carl was talking about, to be on the forefront and fund those proof of concept projects. But we can't do it on our own. We, as you know, have a long track record of being a convener, of bringing people together, trying to get them to think collectively about good ideas. It's one of amfAR's true strengths. We also, I think, have a pretty good track record on some of the research investments that we've made over our 25-plus year history. Probably many of those you've heard about. If you look in your programs, you'll see some of them. Things like funding the early studies of prevention of mother-to-child transmission, funding Dr. Ned Landau's work on CCR5, early work on 4 of the classes of drugs which are now approved to treat people, and the list goes on. We have an enviable track record, but the reality is we can't do it on our own. And the final reality is that if you want to make a difference in the AIDS epidemic, there's no single act. There's nothing that any individual can do to make a greater difference in the AIDS epidemic than your support of AIDS research. Because in reality, the one thing that's going to bring this epidemic to an end is the very kind of research that you've heard about today. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir because I know so many of you are dedicated amfAR supporters. And I know that we've asked so much of you in the past, and I promise that we will ask much more of you into the future. Because the reality is, by doing this, by doing what we do, by funding these group of scientists and so many more who are on the forefront of this epidemic, that's the way I promise you that together we will ultimately make AIDS history.